Good morning, Revolution. Welcome to our Friday morning program. We're here every Friday morning about 10:30 in the morning. We started a little late today, technical difficulties, but I'm glad to have you here. And thank you for joining us. Of course, if you miss it, we're streaming on Facebook and X and Twitter, and Twitch and YouTube. And then if you miss it, you can just go to our YouTube channel and subscribe to the YouTube channel while you're there for Communist Party USA and watch all of our old videos. So welcome everyone, and I welcome Eric, Justine, and Ben. And just to start us off, we'll have a little introductions. My name's Anita. I'll start. I'm in Columbus, Ohio right now. And Ben, let's hear from you. Where are you in geographically and politically? What do you do?
All right. Thanks, Anita. Hi, comrades. My name's Ben. I'm from Boston. I live in New York City now. I'm a working musician here in New York, and I'm do a lot of labor solidarity work. I'm real interested in building and expanding the labor movement, and so I'm working with some incredible people on this emerging formation called Left Labor in New York, and we're really excited about that and excited about building towards May Day 2025. That's what I got going on.
Excellent. Thanks, Ben. Yeah, that's sounds like a very exciting May Day. Really different than past May. Well, a new era perhaps. So, Justine, you want to introduce yourself briefly?
Yes, good morning. Good morning, Anita. Good morning, comrades. I'm Justine Medina. She, her pronouns, grew up in Florida, live in New York City, and I work at Amazon and am a member of the Amazon Labor Union, ALUIBT Local 1. And I'm in the Communist Party, active here in New York. I also work on Cuba solidarity issues as a Cuban American. And yeah, I'm really happy to be here.
Thanks, Justine. Yes, welcome. Eric,
Hi, so I'm Eric, and I grew up in New York. I live in Indianapolis, Indiana now, and I work around issues of stopping police violence and stopping ICE violence and protecting immigrants. And uh, I've been a longtime party member, and I'm very happy to be here with all of you. Thank you.
thanks, Eric. Yeah, we have a really topical program today. We have the Pope's last word to J.D. Vance. Anyway, we suspect could be summed up with the word shame. But let's step back for a minute and talk about the Pope. I mean, I know I'm an ex-Catholic, a devout ex-Catholic. I used to describe myself as a devout ex-Catholic. That's someone who I can criticize the Pope, but I don't want other people to criticize the Pope. So that was my ex-Catholic first perspective. But now I'm willing to hear any criticism. But I was really struck by this Pope in particular. I think we all have some experience with him and his policies. And I thought we'd just start with some of the points of Pope Francis's legacy, and maybe we'll go to each of you. Positive or negative. Did he ultimately disappoint you, or what were some positives about his papacy? And what would you like to see? Well, we'll wait for the future coming up. But what were his most important contributions or deficiencies in your estimation? We'll start with you, Ben. What do you think?
Okay. Well, for me, I always think that we have to ground, our perspective on any religious figures in a materialist understanding of the various institutions or any other, any social leader. We have to ground in the material evaluation of the institutions that they're the head of. So, I think we always have to start that. Separate from belief or whatever, just talking about the structure of the institution. The Catholic Church is the largest landlord on earth. It runs several banks. and it exists, and it has its own private army and security force, and it exists, in a highly, anti-democratic structure that's historically been very reactionary. So I think when we look at Jorge Mario Bergoglio, was his given name before he became Pope Francis's legacy, we have to view it in the historical context that he came out of. Throughout most of the 20th century, the Catholic Church hierarchy was the major ally of anti-imperialism of colonial powers around the world, and of the far right in Europe. And there's a long history there, which is worth getting into. Bergoglio came out of an Argentina and a Latin America that was roiling with socialist and peasant movements, in which many Catholic priests played a supporting role. So the Jesuit order, which he came out of, played a historic role in Latin American socialist movements. However, this was contrary to the interests of the hierarchy. And so Bergoglio, we can say, survived the dictatorship in Argentina. Many of his friends did not. And worked his way up to a place where he could attempt to influence this massive institution in progressive ways. He made many progressive social statements, which were a large contrast to his predecessor, Cardinal Ratzinger, who became Pope Benedict, who, by the way, was the head of the Inquisition in Latin America, responsible for excommunicating many of his friends who then were killed by those regimes. So the stakes for these are not low stakes. And Pope Francis, I think, did his best to promote a more inclusive social vision, to promote but we always have to understand that the nature of the institution he was working within. So he tried to audit the Vatican Bank multiple times. Those attempts were stymied. While he challenged the far right in Uganda, the anti-gay legislation with his statements, he didn't threaten them with excommunication, which is the ultimate sort of lever of power. So I think he did his best in an institution which can best be described as, one of the historic bastions of the reaction in the world. And so the fact that he survived and managed to make progressive social pronouncements and strengthen the progressive wing within this institution obviously is a good thing. But we should, of course, be very measured, I think, in our evaluation of any such power structures and our relationship to them.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Ben. Yeah, that was a really good, you bring some important points up that not everybody, I'm sure, is in tune with. Justine, what would you have to add to that?
Sure. Yes, thank you, Ben, for starting us off with the history, because that's very important. Very important when analyzing Pope Francis, or Bergoglio, as he was before that. And of course, everything Ben said was true. I have a lot of praise I want to give the late Pope, but I do want to start with mentioning, of course, he was the Pope. He was the head of the Catholic Church, and he therefore supported teachings of the Catholic Church that we do see as reactionary, particularly around transgender people and LGBTQ issues, right? Although even within the church, even him condemning, transgender people in like a light way and saying like, but we should still welcome them into the church, was too much and too progressive for the far right of the Catholic Church. But other than those social issues, Ben is absolutely right. Francis is really known for pushing social justice issues within the church. He was a vocal critic of capitalism. He was a vocal critic of war. Over the last year and a half, he's been a very vocal critic of the genocide in Palestine by Israel. And his final sermon, his final Easter address was about Gaza and calling for peace. And so I think it's very important to highlight that. Um, and put that out there. And the other thing that a lot of people don't know as much because it's so much inside baseball is he was also a proponent of democratizing the church. He wouldn't use those words within the catechism. It's talked about synodality, but the Pope was pushing for more synodality within the church, meaning less centralization, less just straight orders from the Pope, and more consultation with the rest of the church and with the lay people. And he was not just pushing for more consultation, but he was pushing for ultimately these meetings to have as much weight as sort of the papal statements themselves. So in the 2,000-year-old institution of the Catholic Church, of course, this is, heretical to some far right factions of it, who really hated the Pope and wanted him dead, and are now going to be fighting tooth and nail to claw back not just the progressive economic reforms that he was promoting, but also the democratic reforms that he was promoting. And for those of us who fight for democracy, I think we should be paying close attention to that battle within the institution of the church and who's gonna have the next seat.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Justine. Yes, and the social justice issues as well. Eric, the same question for you. What do you think will be the legacy of this Pope going forward?
I think the legacy of the Pope is going to be defined by how long will be defined by whether people pick up the fight for internal democracy inside of the church, inside of the Catholic Church or not, and whether they continue with the pro-human dignity aspects that he was fighting for. And by that, I mean recognizing the genocide in Gaza as something that has to stop and has to be addressed in meeting the needs of the Palestinian peoples for self-determination, but also I think it's important to see him not just inside the context of the church, but inside of the context of the larger religious community, which has different tensions in it, pulling in different directions, as everybody has been talking about, in terms of pulling to the right and pulling to the left, or pulling for more controlling top-down control versus more people's power. And it's important to see him as a figure who stood up for the dignity of people against people like J.D. Vance, who is using religious rhetoric as a bludgeon to try to diminish any kind of fight back against the Trump agenda, and to diminish the respect and the dignity that should and must be afforded to all working people and all oppressed people, not only in this country but in the whole world. So the fact that he stood up to them to a certain degree makes me feel a sense of loss with his passing. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. Yes, it is, and he also, I feel, he recognized the economic, the importance of political economy in the world in terms of how rich and poor. He recognized class struggle, although he didn't always acknowledge it. He also acknowledged things like climate change, which was a completely new thing for the papacy. But let's talk about how he clashed with our current vice president. Well, let's first talk about what is was his relationship with the Trump administration, Trump 1.0 and Trump 2.0. Ben, do you want to start us off there? How has he clashed with had he clashed with Trump and Trumpism in the past?
Yes. Well, also, but just to pick up on what Eric said to maybe lead into that, I do think it's worth acknowledging. I mean, I think we have to acknowledge in this moment the historic, how far the left has been beaten back. That the Pope, the head of the Catholic Church, is recognized globally as a left-wing figure. I mean, I think we have to at least acknowledge some irony in this. Catholic social teaching has always included certain social progressive ideas about economy. The Catholic Church set up its own labor unions in Europe and throughout the world so that they wouldn't be associated with communist labor unions. So, I mean, the Catholic Church had their own political parties. One can go down the list. So, in a lot of ways, what Francis did was not new, but things have gone so far to the right that it's a breath of fresh air from the previous pope, who spent his youth in the Hitler Youth, and spent his most of his career again sort of hunting down liberation theologists in Latin America. So the Pope. So and then with J.D. Vance, I mean, we have to look at this as well. There are these incredibly reactionary, ultra reactionary, super online cultures and cults. The trad calf cult, which sort of J.D. Vance and many other people, is hyper masculinist, hyper traditionalist, reactionary social phenomenon. So in that way, we shouldn't be surprised that, basic Catholic humanism will ultimately come into conflict, with the ultra reactionary far right. And so, of course, Trump's depraved personal behavior, the absolute depravity of U.S. imperialism and of the climate crisis. I mean, in other words, it just shows that things have gotten so bad in this country and with the ruling class globally that even basic Catholic humanism is against it. Um, However, again, this doesn't necessarily speak to the strength of the workers' movements and the people's democratic movements, but it speaks to the outrage of the current political climate in the United States. And so, of course, the Pope has roundly condemned every aspect of the Trump administration's environmental policy, labor rights policy, the American empire, Gaza. It's so central that, it comes out today. I think probably one of the most admirable things in terms of his legacy. He's evidently been on the phone every day with church leaders in Gaza. So, I mean, he obviously, felt it deeply. That just came out yesterday, that he was having personal phone calls with all the Christian, Palestinian religious leaders on a literally daily basis. So, I think the man himself was very admirable, clearly felt these things deeply. It's hard not to be revolted by Trump and JD Vance if you're like a human being, So I think he expressed these kind of humanistic things very admirably. But again, as has been said, the institution itself, I think many of us are worried about a kind of Empire Strikes Back realignment now that he's dead, which will have political consequences for us around the world. But he took on the Trump administration in no uncertain terms, and of course that should be celebrated. So.
That's right. Absolutely. Of course, you're right that J.D. Vance is associated with this traditional Catholic movement that I did some Googling this morning, and there are some churches that really go back. And I remember Vatican II, which happened in the 1960s when I was a student in Catholic elementary school, when they changed so many things. They changed from a Latin Mass, from where the priest was standing on the altar, right? And all those things changed. And these churches, these traditional churches, traditional Catholic churches, are going back to the 1964, 1965 styles and rituals, and ignoring all the other issues. So, what do we know, Justine? Could you tell us something about what we know about J.D. Vance's religious background approaching this weekend in Rome?
I mean, I apologize for not, um, having quite the encyclopedic knowledge base that Comrade Ben carries with him. I don't remember J.D. Vance's uh, full, biography in terms of his Catholicism, though now I really want to look it up. But he is part of Ben is correct, the far right, Catholic movement, and yeah, he is a convert to Catholicism, which it's actually, of course, where you see most trad Caths, right? It's like most far right Catholics these days are converts, which is, of course, an irony. And there's a joke that goes around online that people that are raised Catholic are always like, I think that we should feed poor people, and people that are converts, scream about, like you were saying, Anita, like needing to go back to the Latin Mass and screaming about like papal edicts from the 15th century. And JD Vance is one of these far right Catholics. We have far right Catholics like this on our Supreme Court. We have far right Catholics like this sort of all over important roles of the Republican Party. And the U.S. is the bastion of far right Catholicism. As Ben was saying, the Catholic Church, or rather, Catholic movements within the church have always had social justice teachings as part of them, and those movements were particularly popular in Latin America, but the far right splits of the church have become particularly popular in the United States, and those bishops and cardinals are the ones who are going to be fighting to try to take over the papacy and undo all of the really important work that the Pope has been doing. And he really has been. I mean, it is, to Ben's point, we definitely should point out and appreciate the irony of the Pope being a left-wing figure. But the reality is, with how far right this world has been, he has been a major figure for peace, and for fighting against imperialism, not just in Israel, but also, not just fighting against Israel, but also trying to end the war in Ukraine, talking about the wars that the West wages on Africa. The Catholic Church developed a good diplomatic relationship with the People's Republic of China, which was the first of its kind, actually. The church hadn't developed in the PRC's history. So the Pope was really pushing the envelope for peace issues, and to bring peace and democracy to the world. And that's against everything that JD Vance stands for. So that's why he had to kill the Pope.
Well, Eric, what did Vance do that really got under Pope Francis's skin? I mean, I know he had his top cardinal read Vance the Riot Act the day before he met with him. Originally, there was going to be no meeting with the Pope, but he did send his envoy to give Vance that shame message. So what did Vance do that really pissed off Pope Francis?
Well, that's a very deep question, and I would say Vance epitomizes the opposite of what the Pope was fighting for. So when you look at J.D. Vance, you're looking at somebody who wraps white chauvinism, racism, and misogyny up into religion. He covers that with a religious patina, or a religious covering that he uses to attempt to justify the hate that he represents, and that was challenged by Pope Francis, and that just the Pope challenging it is important, and it's also important to understand the kind of response that would have gotten from somebody like J.D. Vance and from the Trump MAGA administration, which does not brook well with being challenged in any way. And I wanted to step back a little bit to talk about the fact that in World War II, the Catholic Church played a very bad role, and it was aligned with um, with the Nazi parties in different countries. And so when we look at the growth of similar kinds of ideologies today in Europe and in the United States, especially here with Trump and J.D. Vance, we have to say that it was outstanding in that context for Pope Francis to really fight for the dignity of the global masses of people. And the other thing is that um, Pope Francis was not the institution of the church. He was a person, and he was trying to influence an institution. And I think that there's a lesson there to be learned, because there are institutions here in this country that can be influenced in different directions, and that what we need to do is fight for big people's movements that will influence those institutions to address the needs of working people and oppressed people here, just the way that Pope Francis was fighting for his institution, the Catholic Church, to address those, and fighting against a lot of internal winds that did not want those kinds of reforms to take place. We have to understand that those kinds of winds, both for the people and against the people, when operate, those contradictions operate in a lot of forms, in a lot of structures and organizations, and that we need to make sure that we're not shying away from engaging with them, but we have to.
Uh-oh, you're muted
Conrad.
suddenly.
We have to engage in a way that will strengthen the people's movements within the more democratic movements within those institutions. And that is a challenge for us today here in the United States. And I think we have to understand that it's a challenge that has to be won now. Thanks.
Exactly. Yeah, another aspect of that last address that his cardinal actually delivered on Easter morning to the crowd there really focused in on migrants too. And he condemned very roundly the attempt to demonize migration. What is there something? I'll turn to you, Justine, as the Catholic, as one of the people raised in the Catholic Church here. What does Catholic social doctrine tell us about? What policies does it lead to in terms of migration and refugees in particular? Oh, you're muted.
Sorry about
Okay.
that. Yeah, well, the progressive wing of the Catholic Church, has always been about, I mean, it's trite, but loving your neighbor, right? The Good Samaritan, as a story from the Bible, is one that I was very fond of as a child, and was taught, sort of as a basis of the sort of social teaching ideology. As a kid, I went to primarily Jesuit, and then Franciscan, um, schools, and that tend to have more progressive currents. Although in the South there are a lot of conservative Jesuits, even though Jesuits tend to be progressive, which is Francis's order. He came from Jesuits. But yeah, I mean, the progressive wings of the church have always been about welcoming everyone. There are no, everyone is a child of God, right? And so Francis, of course, believed in this teaching, and uh, he he was really against all of the anti-immigrant rhetoric that is sweeping, of course, the United States, but also Western Europe. And of course, he would talk about the ways this would materially impact people and lead to death and war and destruction. But yeah, the people that try to say that that God would want us to have borders, or that God would want you to see your neighbor, the immigrant, or the homeless person, or the struggling person, as your enemy. It can't be found really anywhere within the actual doctrinal teachings of the church. The church has long pushed these things as an institution, but doctrinally, you know, yeah, taking care of your neighbor is at the basis of Catholic social teachings and acts. So that definitely includes immigrants.
Thank you. And I'm glad you brought up the Jesuit part, because the Jesuits are an order. I think the Berrigan brothers were Jesuits, if I'm not mistaken. And they are a progressive group. One person who had a famously Jesuit education is Fidel Castro. So there has long been a tradition of progressive thinking in that particular denomination. I don't think it's called a denomination. I think it's there's another word. Order. Thank you, Ben. You're good. Well, to get back to the question, Ben, that you might know this. Then, what was the pseudo-theological gloss that Vance attempted to put on the Trump immigration mass deportation policy? That I think that was what really pissed off Pope Francis last January. Do you remember that story at all, Ben?
Yeah, well, I think again here it is worth remembering. I mean, because when we talk about our party, Marx famously chastised the anarchists in the movement, and even Engels and others. We obviously believe in we don't make religious belief a litmus test for working with working class, with any sectors of the working class. However, we do, analyzing the structures of what we're working with. For instance, the nature of democracy in the Catholic Church is this: you have to be a celibate male who becomes ordained a priest, who then becomes a cardinal and is promoted to have a say in who becomes pope. In other words, there's virtually no democracy within the Catholic Church. Now, what Justine was saying, this gets to the J.D. Vance thing about synodality, is really important. So, like, the big move in Vatican II has been a push towards what many other forms of religion have had for centuries and millennia, which is the idea of congregational polity, which is the idea that local organization, so that would bring some democracy. And this is important because the way that politics work now in the Catholic Church is basically every order does. So we can talk about another order. So the Jesuit order, famously left-wing in Latin America. There's another order called the Society for Pope Pius X, which has been variously enfranchised or not, which is filled with Holocaust deniers, pro-fascist, whack jobs, etc. And so what happens is these orders compete for influence, right? So the trad cath movement is currently trying to compete for influence. So J.D. Vance was pushing. I mean, in other words, there's a sort of set of criteria, anti-immigrant, anti-worker, even racist criteria that the alt-right within the Catholic Church pushes. But again, this all has to do with property relations of the institution,
breaking up a little bit, Ben,
etc. So I would just say that our best hope as progressives is to work with progressive movements within the Catholic Church. And so J.D. Vance represents an ultra-right that has to be opposed. And if we can work with progressive forces to do that, we should. Oh, I see that there's some connection problems. Okay.
I'm back.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
So in other words, Amy Coney Barrett, as Justine was mentioning, also this alt-right tendency within the Catholic Church through the Heritage Foundation has gained enormous power in the current American right wing. But as I say, this, as we should all know, this has massive historic precedent, going all the way back to an outright pro-fascist, policies of the Catholic Church. So, we should work with progressive people. Sister Carita, the famous anti-war nun who was a pop artist and lived in Boston, was friends with Andy Warhol. I mean, there's a wonderful history, the Berrigan brothers, of the Catholic left. The problem is, without democratizing the hierarchy, they've never ever gained any power. And again, the previous pope before Francis played no small role in crushing the liberation theology that everyone loves to talk about in Latin America, enabling assassinations, actually, things like that. So,
right, exactly. And I was also thinking about the way that Vance came out with this crazy idea that there's circles, concentric circles of caring, and that the Catholic Church wants you to be nice to your, especially look out for your family, and then you don't really care about those other people over there. And the letter that Pope Francis wrote to the American bishops in response to that was like a slap, slap, slap to J.D. Vance. You think you can do theology with in your 6th year as a Catholic convert? No, you can't. And it's a beautiful letter that really uses the word dignity numerous times, but really sticks up for the dignity and well-being of all immigrants, all refugees. It's a beautiful letter, actually. That was back in February. So he, of course, Vance has dug his heels in, and so had Francis, I think, before that came up. So just a little bit more. I'll go to Eric now. We were going to have a person from the Religion Commission. The CPUSA has a Religion Commission, and it is an established body in our party. Eric, what do you think? Why do you think we even have a Religion Commission? Because aren't all communist atheists like me, or what?
So the Communist Party grows out of the working class, and it grows out, particularly the Communist Party USA grows out of the working class in the United States. The working class in the United States has a lot of folks who are religious, and we welcome them. There are also religious institutions that are in their communities, very active on behalf of their communities and their constituents. They're members of the church. So we welcome people who are religious to join us in fighting for the needs of working and oppressed people in this country. And we welcome people, actually we welcome everybody who's a member of the working class or a member of the oppressed to join us in this struggle. And so please join. Please think about joining, since we're talking about it. But the question really is, what is our relationship with institutions of religious institutions around the country? And the Religion Commission wants to, as I understand it, not being a member of that commission, wants to understand the political trends that are active in that community. It wants to make relationships with folks and with institutions in that community, and it wants to help to advance the integration of religious people into the broad people's movement to fight for the needs of working people and for democracy and for a rule of law now in this country. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Justine. What we have our perspective of historical materialism, and here you have, like you said, an institution of the papacy, an institution of the Roman Catholic Church in general, That's, I guess they say it's from the year 30 in the Common Era. So, quite nearly 2,000 years old. So it has been existing as an institution over more than one ruling class, over the years. What do you think is it's been around despite revolutions that really replace one ruling class with another ruling class. So what do we make of the papacy and how we would like to see it move forward, or if you could have some influence on the papacy right now, or on the institution, how would you like to see that go?
Sure. Well, yeah, I mean, I think the survival of the church has been about what Ben talked about in the beginning of the show, where it's a 2,000-year-old imperial force, with a lot of real property and a real policing force, a real armed forces. It's essentially a country, except with a sort of type of king that has influence over people in every country, right? So that, and then for a long time, it was, of course, the top imperial power, um, you know, for millennia, right? Um, but yeah, in terms of where we want to see the church go, um, I think what Pope Francis was pushing for, or many of the things he was pushing for, is what we should um, support in all institutions, right? Like more democratization, more of a fighting for, while there are, of course, reactionary doctrinal gender stuff within the church, the Pope was fighting to get women having more of a role within the democracy of the church. Sort of some movement towards, progressive social stuff, perhaps women becoming priests in the future, or priests being able to marry. These types of things are still live struggles within the church. And I think these are the things we should push for, and more importantly, the democracy issues and the social justice issues. And the way that we support those movements are the way anywhere in the world. It's like what Eric was saying. We find the progressive movements that are near us, the progressive Catholic movements, like Catholic Worker, locals, LGBTQ, Catholic societies, things like this. And we make connections with them, and we find out how to support them. And we work with their churches and their movements, and we grow them. And that's how you grow the influence within the church, because that's how Francis worked his way up, right? Was even at a time when the church was very far right, he was able to work with his comrades in the struggle in the Jesuits, and work up to becoming like super influential. So we to say the least, super influential is putting it lightly. So we can support Catholics locally who are also struggling for those things.
And actually, could I jump in with a specific remark? So several things. Yeah, exactly. So, and again, the Vatican II fundamentally broke open the central control of the papacy. So this is the thing. So like what Francis also did, and the way you sort of let things happen in the Catholic Church, I guess, is turning a blind eye to things which clash with Catholic doctrine. So under Pope Francis, there were many priests in Germany who just were out and out performing same-sex marriages. Now that goes against Catholic doctrine. He turned a blind eye to it. In New York, there's out at St. Paul's, which is like a famous gay Catholic group that meets in a church. And again, the turning a blind eye thing is just not banning them, right? But again, this is, and I think to Justine's point, to what we've been saying, this is so far from the idea of democratic people's movements. I mean, it was a historic goal of the Italian socialist movement to simply expropriate the entire church, right, for centuries. It's April 25th. Sorry, I'm in like an Italian mood. 80th anniversary of the end of fascism, and Garibaldi, who was the famous Italian socialist, his last political act, was to try to march on the Vatican, to do just that. But again, I think it's important to say there are so many progressive trends, but we're not anarchists and we're not social democrats. We take a holistic view. Nevertheless, I think that when we look at how socialist states have interacted with the Catholic Church or with the Russian Orthodox Church, which deserves a shout out when we're talking about reactionary historical forces, I think it comes down to property relations. We don't want to shame people out of beliefs and culture and these sort of rich literary traditions that accompany religion. However, I think it's a fair thing to say that properties should be publicly owned. And just as a small anecdote, and in socialist states, the properties were publicly owned and well maintained by public money, and religious groups could meet in those properties and non-religious groups. Just as a small anecdote, I have a friend who's Polish, and in his village, his grandfather was there when the socialism happened in Poland. And what socialism meant in their village was that the priests' vast estates were turned into public parks. And what the return of the far right in Poland has meant is that the church is getting those properties back. And so I think on a very clear level, we see that, in the Spanish Revolution and Latin American revolutions, that some of the first acts of peasant, campesino, and socialist revolutions were to expropriate church land because, priests were frequently literally landlords, in some cases wielding whips over peasants. Just as there were priests who were head of concentration camps in Croatia. The Catholic Church in Croatia was, fully involved in running the concentration camps there. We have to look at property relations, and we have to support the democratic aspirations. So much of Latin American socialist song and language and poetry is in the language of religion. So we have to know how to interact with that. I mean, one of Victor Jara's most beautiful songs is a version of the Lord's Prayer, but with a socialist. So that's fine, but we have to never lose sight of that we are fighting against oppressive property relations and anti-democratic institutions.
Right, absolutely, and I think we'll probably leave it there. We've gone on a little long today, but I think this is a really important conversation. We know religion is the sigh of the oppressed and the heart in a heartless world, and we have a heartless world right now, and people find solace in religious teaching. Pope Francis nominated or appointed 80% of the cardinals who will be voting on his replacement. So that bodes well for a continuation of the direction that he was taking it. So we'll see what happens. So thank you all for being here, and thank you to the audience for tuning in. And I look forward to seeing you next Friday at 10:30. Good Morning Revolution, our regular program. So thanks, Eric. Thanks, Ben.